You ever have someone call the police on you so confidently that you can actually see the exact moment they realize they just made the biggest mistake of their entire life? Because I have. And trust me, watching that kind of arrogance collapse in real time is something you do not forget. The first thing I noticed that afternoon was the sunlight reflecting off the windshield of the sheriff cruiser parked 20 feet from my dock. Bright enough to catch me halfway down the gravel path leading back from the northern side of Blackwater Lake where I had spent the last 2 hours fishing alone, exactly the way I liked spending most of my mornings. The air smelled like warm pine bark baking under late August heat, mixed with fresh water and the faint mineral scent the lake always carried when the wind shifted west across the ridge. In my left hand I still held the graphite fishing rod I had been using since sunrise. 3 largemouth bass sat inside the cooler strapped to the back of my utility cart. It had been a good morning. Peaceful. Quiet. Predictable. Which was exactly why the scene waiting outside my cabin immediately felt wrong. Standing beside the sheriff cruiser with both hands planted firmly on her hips like she personally owned every acre within 50 miles was Veronica Hayes. 52 years old, perfectly styled blonde hair that somehow looked untouched by the humidity, oversized designer sunglasses covering half her face, expensive white summer blouse pressed so sharply it looked like it had never experienced a single wrinkle in its existence. Parked directly behind her sat the same white Range Rover I had seen circling the Blackwater Shores subdivision 3 separate times that month. The woman had introduced herself exactly 1 week earlier and somehow managed to irritate me within the first 30 seconds of conversation. But standing there now beside the sheriff vehicle, smiling the kind of smile people wear when they think authority is about to validate their ego, she looked even more insufferable than I remembered. The deputy standing next to her noticed me first. Tall guy. Mid-30s maybe. Tan uniform. Aviator sunglasses. One hand resting casually near his utility belt while his eyes tracked me walking slowly down toward the dock. Veronica turned immediately the second she saw movement. "There he is, officer," she said loudly enough that I was pretty sure she wanted the entire shoreline hearing every word. "That is the man I was telling you about. The one refusing lawful community compliance." I stopped about 10 feet away and looked past both of them toward the lake stretching wide behind the dock, afternoon sunlight shimmering across nearly 400 acres of perfectly still water disappearing into tree line on the far eastern ridge. Then I looked back at Veronica. Her smile widened slightly. She thought this was over already. Thought the badge standing beside her meant she controlled the next few minutes. What Veronica Hayes did not know in that exact moment, standing there with all that confidence dripping off every expensive piece of clothing she was wearing, was something very simple. The water behind her. Every inch of it. Every shoreline. Every dock. Every single acre she thought her precious homeowners association controlled belonged entirely to me. I did not answer either of them right away because standing there on the western shoreline of Blackwater Lake with the afternoon breeze rolling across the water, I found myself thinking how strange it was that some people could spend their entire lives chasing peace and somehow still end up dealing with the exact kind of people they worked so hard to avoid. 7 years earlier I bought this place for one reason and one reason only. Silence. Not vacation silence. Not temporary weekend silence where the city still followed you through phone calls, traffic noise, and neighbors mowing lawns 3 feet outside your bedroom window. I wanted permanent silence. Real silence. The kind you only find when your nearest neighbor sits half a mile away and the loudest thing you hear most mornings is wind moving through pine trees or bass breaking the surface of still water before sunrise. That was why I built the cabin exactly where I was standing now, tucked against the northern ridge overlooking the deepest section of the lake where morning fog always drifted low over the water between 5 and 6:30 every day without fail. I designed everything intentionally. Floor-to-ceiling windows facing east so sunrise hit directly across the kitchen island every morning. A private cedar dock extending 40 feet into the water for fishing access. Solar backup systems hidden behind the maintenance shed because I hated relying on utility companies. Gravel roads instead of pavement. No fences. No unnecessary structures. Just 32 acres of preserved shoreline surrounding the cabin and 400 acres of freshwater stretching beyond it in every direction. People hear the word millionaire and immediately picture penthouses, sports cars, or private jets. I never understood that mentality. Real wealth is privacy. Real wealth is waking up without hearing another human voice unless you choose to. Most mornings I sat exactly where that sheriff cruiser was parked now, drinking black coffee while reading market reports before heading out on the lake in my 19-foot aluminum fishing boat. No meetings. No corporate dinners. No social obligations. Just water, silence, and enough distance between me and the rest of the world that I could finally breathe properly. Which was exactly why Veronica Hayes irritated me so quickly the first time she appeared at my front door 6 days earlier. I remember the smell of sunscreen hitting me before she even introduced herself, standing on my porch in expensive wedge sandals holding a thick blue folder stamped with Blackwater Shores Homeowners Association across the front in oversized gold lettering. She smiled politely enough at first, but I noticed it immediately. That look certain people carry when they have spent so long being obeyed they genuinely cannot imagine hearing the word no. She explained neighborhood membership standards, community recreational privileges, mandatory compliance procedures, annual dues, property guidelines, shared waterfront governance. I let her finish speaking for nearly 3 full minutes before calmly telling her something simple. I was not interested. I still remember how quickly her expression changed after that. It was subtle. Almost invisible. But standing there now watching her beside that patrol car with the exact same smile stretched across her face while the deputy waited for my response, I understood something much more important than whatever ridiculous complaint she had made. Veronica Hayes was not here because I broke some community rule. She was here because 6 days ago, for the first time in a very long time, somebody had told her no. The truth is I probably should have paid more attention the first day Veronica Hayes showed up because looking back now, every warning sign had been there from the second she stepped out of that white Range Rover and walked up my front porch like somebody conducting a property inspection instead of introducing herself to a neighbor. Some people have this strange ability to make confidence look artificial, and Veronica had perfected it. 52 years old, maybe 53, tall enough that the expensive wedge sandals she wore only made her look more imposing, perfectly straight blonde hair resting neatly against a sleeveless cream summer blouse that probably cost more than most people spend on a week of groceries. Even standing 3 feet away I remember noticing how polished everything about her seemed, right down to the oversized designer sunglasses perched perfectly above makeup applied with surgical precision. She did not look like somebody who managed a homeowners association. She looked like somebody who spent years convincing people she was important enough to never hear disagreement. Over the following week I learned quickly that my first impression had been generous. Blackwater Shores sat about half a mile south of my property, a luxury waterfront subdivision developed 6 years earlier when outside investors started buying land around the eastern ridge hoping to capitalize on premium lake access. Large modern homes. Stone driveways. Private tennis courts. Infinity pools overlooking water views. They advertised heavily during sales presentations. Veronica became president of their homeowners association less than 8 months after moving in, and according to the local contractor who installed my solar backup system 2 years earlier, she immediately turned the entire community into her personal kingdom. Fines for landscaping violations. Parking restrictions. Mandatory exterior paint approvals. Complaints over unapproved patio furniture visible from neighboring lots. The kind of petty suburban control games people somehow convince themselves represent civilized living. Normally I would not have cared because I deliberately positioned my property outside the subdivision boundaries during the original purchase negotiations years earlier. No easements connected me to Blackwater Shores. No contractual obligations. No shared maintenance agreements. I existed entirely separate from their little manufactured ecosystem of regulations and unnecessary authority. Apparently Veronica found that deeply offensive. 3 days after our first meeting I noticed her vehicle parked slowly outside my gravel access road for nearly 10 minutes before driving away. The next afternoon she returned carrying another folder, this time noticeably less friendly. She explained that because my property bordered community waterfront zones, I was expected to participate in annual association membership requirements. I remember leaning against the porch rail listening to her repeat phrases like mandatory compliance procedures, collective lake stewardship, and shared shoreline governance as though simply speaking confidently enough could somehow transform fiction into legal authority. When she finished, I gave her the exact same answer I gave during the first visit. No, thank you. That was the moment everything changed. Her smile disappeared completely for the first time. You understand, everybody living around Blackwater Lake follows community standards, she said sharply enough that even the birds nesting near the maintenance shed suddenly felt louder. I looked directly at her and answered with one sentence. I am not everybody. She stared at me for several long seconds before turning sharply and walking back toward her vehicle without another word. Standing there now beside the sheriff cruiser watching that same woman glare at me across the dock with all that controlled anger hidden behind expensive sunglasses, I understood something simple. Veronica Hayes was never trying to welcome me into her community. She had already decided that anyone beyond her control automatically became a problem she needed to eliminate. The strange thing about people like Veronica is that once they realize intimidation does not work privately, they immediately start looking for an audience. I learned that exactly 48 hours after our second conversation when I heard tires crunching against the gravel outside my cabin just after noon while I was inside the workshop replacing the drag washers on an old saltwater reel I had owned for nearly a decade. The afternoon heat had settled heavily over Blackwater Lake that day, thick enough that even with both workshop doors open the smell of cut cedar and machine oil hung stubbornly in the air around me. I remember wiping grease from my hands onto an old cotton rag when I noticed voices drifting from outside. More than one this time. I stepped out onto the porch and immediately understood what Veronica was doing. Parked beside my driveway sat her white Range Rover along with two other luxury sport utility vehicles I had never seen before. Standing near the truck beds were four people, all dressed with that same polished upper-class suburban uniform I had already come to associate with Blackwater shores. Expensive sunglasses. Lightweight golf attire. Perfectly styled hair despite 90-degree heat pressing down from a cloudless Texas sky. Veronica stood in front of them holding that familiar blue association folder against her chest, except this time her expression had changed completely. Gone was the fake friendliness from our first conversation. She looked energized now. Like someone preparing to perform. There he is, she announced loudly enough that I knew immediately this was not a conversation anymore. This was theater. The four people behind her turned toward me simultaneously, each carrying the exact same expression people wear when they have already decided who the villain is before hearing a single word. Veronica stepped forward onto the bottom porch step without asking permission. Mr. Cole has repeatedly refused compliance with established Blackwater Shores community membership standards, she said while gesturing dramatically toward me like she was presenting evidence during a courtroom trial. As board members, we have made every reasonable effort to resolve this peacefully. I leaned casually against the porch railing and studied the small crowd assembled on my property. One older man with silver hair stood holding a clipboard while a woman in oversized designer sunglasses typed something into her phone without even looking at me. They all looked deeply uncomfortable being there, but none of them interrupted Veronica. She interpreted silence as support. Harrison, she said sharply now, today I am giving you one final opportunity to comply voluntarily before formal action begins. I almost smiled hearing that. Formal action. Such an impressive phrase when spoken by people who think expensive neighborhoods somehow grant legal authority over strangers. What exactly do you think you control here, Veronica? The second those words left my mouth, I saw irritation flash across her face. She turned slightly so the others standing behind her could hear every syllable. We control every residential property surrounding this lake and every homeowner benefiting from protected community waterfront access. Refusal to comply creates direct legal conflict for the entire neighborhood. I stared at her for several quiet seconds while warm wind pushed across the lake behind me carrying the smell of freshwater and sun-baked pine needles drifting through the ridgeline. Then I gave her the exact same answer I had already given twice before. No. This time she did not even try hiding the anger. "Fine," she said coldly while stepping backward off the porch. "If you refuse to cooperate willingly, I will make sure the proper authorities handle this for you." Watching her turn sharply toward that waiting crowd of obedient board members, I understood something important. Veronica Hayes had stopped trying to convince me. Now she wanted to punish me. By the time I finished walking down the gravel path toward the sheriff cruiser that afternoon, I already knew exactly what Veronica was trying to do because people like her all follow the same pattern once control starts slipping through their fingers. First they ask politely because they assume compliance is automatic. Then they escalate publicly because embarrassment becomes a weapon. And when neither tactic works, they reach for borrowed authority, hoping uniforms and badges can force obedience where their own words failed. Standing there now beside the edge of my private dock with warm lake wind moving steadily across the water behind me, I could practically feel the satisfaction radiating off Veronica before a single word had even been exchanged. The deputy adjusted his sunglasses as I approached, posture relaxed but carrying that subtle stiffness officers tend to have when arriving at situations they already believe they understand. Veronica had been talking to him long enough before I arrived that I knew she had already spent the last several minutes building whatever version of reality best suited her. The smell of sunbaked wood drifted up from the dock boards under my boots while somewhere behind the cabin the backup generator kicked softly for a few seconds before shutting down again. Even ordinary sounds felt strangely amplified when tension settles into a place built for peace. The deputy cleared his throat first. "Afternoon, sir. I am Deputy Carter Reynolds with Travis County. We received a complaint regarding refusal to comply with local residential regulations and possible obstruction involving private community property access." I stared at him for exactly 2 seconds longer than most people normally would before shifting my eyes toward Veronica. Her arms were crossed now, expensive sunglasses tilted slightly downward so she could look at me over the frame the same way school principals look at children moments before punishment begins. I had seen that expression on her before. Except now she had an audience. Behind her, parked further back along the gravel shoulder, I noticed 2 familiar luxury vehicles belonging to Blackwater Shores board members from yesterday afternoon. Neither had stepped out, but both were watching through partially lowered windows. Of course they were here. Veronica did not want resolution. She wanted witnesses. Deputy Reynolds glanced down toward the tablet he was holding. "Miss Hayes informs us you have repeatedly refused lawful enrollment into Blackwater Shores Homeowners Association despite residing on property directly attached to managed community lake access zones." I almost smiled hearing that phrase. Managed community lake access zones. Such an impressive collection of words when spoken confidently enough. Before I could answer, Veronica stepped slightly forward, unable to resist inserting herself back into the center of attention. "Officer, I have explained to Mr. Cole multiple times that every residential property surrounding Blackwater Lake falls under mandatory association oversight. We maintain all waterfront compliance standards, recreational access management, and collective shoreline stewardship agreements protecting the value of this community." She said every word loudly, carefully, almost theatrically, making sure the board members watching from their vehicles could hear exactly how powerful she sounded while the uniform beside her reinforced the illusion she controlled everything unfolding around us. Deputy Reynolds nodded slowly, clearly leaning toward the version she had already provided. "Mr. Cole, unless there is some misunderstanding here, refusal to cooperate with valid community governance agreements could create unnecessary legal complications moving forward." I looked out across the lake for a brief second, afternoon sunlight scattering silver reflections across hundreds of acres of perfectly still water stretching far beyond the opposite ridge line. Then I looked back at Veronica. The smile on her face had grown wider now. She genuinely believed this was the moment I finally folded. But standing there listening to both of them repeat rules tied to property neither of them actually understood, I realized something almost funny. Veronica Hayes was so obsessed with forcing me into submission that she had unknowingly built this entire confrontation on one very dangerous assumption. She thought she knew who owned the water behind us. For a few seconds I said absolutely nothing, and that seemed to irritate Veronica more than if I had started arguing, because people like her are deeply uncomfortable around silence when they are expecting submission. The warm afternoon wind pushed gently across the dock behind me, carrying the clean mineral scent of freshwater mixed with sun-heated cedar planks, while somewhere deeper in the pine ridge overhead a pair of crows called back and forth in sharp uneven bursts. Deputy Reynolds shifted his weight slightly, clearly waiting for me to respond to the warning he believed he had just delivered. Veronica stood motionless beside him with both arms folded tightly against her chest, but I noticed something subtle in the way she tilted her chin upward now. Satisfaction. She had reached the exact stage of confrontation she had been chasing all week. Public pressure. Uniformed authority. Witnesses sitting quietly inside those parked luxury vehicles 30 yards away, watching everything unfold exactly the way she planned. I slowly set my fishing rod against the dock rail and looked directly at Deputy Reynolds. "Let me ask you something, officer." He gave a small nod. "Go ahead." I turned my head slightly toward Veronica and then back toward him. "Did Miss Hayes happen to explain exactly what legal authority her homeowners association supposedly has over my property?" Before he answered, Veronica stepped forward immediately, unable to tolerate even 3 seconds without controlling the conversation. Blackwater Shores oversees all surrounding lake compliance agreements and collective waterfront management obligations for every residential property benefiting from access to Blackwater Lake recreational resources. The speed at which she delivered that sentence told me she had repeated it enough times that she no longer questioned whether any of it was actually true. Deputy Reynolds nodded in agreement. "That is essentially what I was told, yes sir." I looked past both of them toward the eastern shoreline nearly half a mile away, where the subdivision sat partially hidden behind clusters of expensive stone houses and decorative boat docks extending out over water they clearly believed belonged to them. Something about that view suddenly caught my attention. Mounted beneath Veronica's left arm was the same oversized blue folder she had carried during both visits to my cabin earlier that week. Only this time a laminated document was sticking partially out from the side, just enough that afternoon sunlight reflected sharply off the plastic coating. A map. I noticed a printed aerial image showing property outlines surrounding the lake. More specifically, I noticed something impossible. Veronica had the lake itself highlighted in blue marker with large printed text stretched directly across the center. Blackwater Shores Community Managed Recreational Waters. I stared at it for several quiet seconds, feeling a slow cold wave move through my chest that had absolutely nothing to do with fear. That phrase should not exist anywhere. Not on county documents. Not on subdivision plans. Not on private surveys. Legally speaking, no homeowners association within 200 miles had authority to designate those waters under community management. Because those waters were never community property to begin with. Which meant one thing instantly became clear. Somewhere inside Blackwater Shores paperwork, somebody had either falsified ownership records or been operating under false legal assumptions for years. Veronica noticed where my eyes had settled and instinctively pulled the folder tighter against her side. The movement was small, but enough. I looked back at her slowly, and for the first time since this entire ridiculous confrontation began, I felt myself becoming genuinely interested. Because suddenly this was no longer about some entitled woman trying to force me into joining her little suburban kingdom. Veronica Hayes had just accidentally shown me the exact mistake that was about to destroy everything she thought she controlled. I kept my eyes on that laminated map tucked beneath Veronica's arm for several more seconds, and the more I looked at it, the more absurd the entire situation became, because now I understood this confrontation had never actually started with me refusing to join her homeowners association. It started much earlier, somewhere inside a conference room full of very confident people making assumptions about property they never bothered verifying. The late afternoon sunlight was beginning to shift lower now, turning the surface of Blackwater Lake into moving sheets of copper and gold, while warm wind pushed softly against the dock supports beneath my boots. Deputy Reynolds stood quietly between us, still holding the tablet he had been using to review whatever complaint Veronica filed, but I noticed his posture had changed slightly. He was paying closer attention now, probably sensing tension had shifted directions even if he did not understand why. Veronica, on the other hand, remained completely certain she was still winning. I could see it in the way she adjusted her sunglasses again, lifting her chin slightly higher like somebody already rehearsing the satisfaction of watching another person surrender publicly. I looked directly at her and asked the simplest question I could think of. Veronica, who exactly told you that Blackwater Shores owns this lake? For the first time in several minutes she smiled again, though this one carried far more arrogance than the polished fake friendliness she wore during our first meeting. Our development attorneys handled all community filings before construction was completed, she said immediately. Every resident here purchased property under legally protected waterfront privileges managed directly by our association. I nodded slowly. Interesting. She misread my expression completely and stepped forward another foot, clearly enjoying what she believed was my hesitation. Officer Reynolds glanced briefly between both of us but said nothing. Veronica crossed one arm over the blue folder pressed against her waist and continued talking before I could respond. We maintain oversight for all surrounding residential access zones, community dock regulations, recreational boating compliance, shoreline development restrictions, and collective environmental management responsibilities attached to Blackwater Lake properties. Every word she spoke only made the situation better. Because people do not repeat lies that confidently unless they have been believing them for a very long time. I looked past her shoulder toward the subdivision sitting quietly along the eastern ridge where dozens of expensive homes overlooked water they apparently believed came bundled with their purchase contracts. Infinity pools glimmered between rows of decorative stone terraces. Private docks extended confidently over shoreline parcels. Luxury pontoon boats floated quietly in small marina slips near the southern cove. Suddenly I realized how deep this problem might actually go. This was bigger than Veronica. Much bigger. Somewhere along the line, Blackwater Shores had sold an entire community on the belief that they possessed legal authority over a body of water they never owned in the first place. And judging by how naturally Veronica kept repeating phrases like managed community waterfront and protected lake privileges, she genuinely had no idea how dangerous that assumption really was. I slowly turned back toward her and noticed the deputy watching me now, his expression more curious than authoritative. Veronica had stopped talking, probably waiting for me to finally submit after hearing what she believed was overwhelming legal certainty. Instead I gave her a small smile, the first genuine smile I had offered since seeing that sheriff cruiser parked outside my dock. Then I asked one final question. Veronica, have you ever actually seen the original ownership deed for Blackwater Lake? The silence that followed felt different somehow. Smaller. Tighter. And judging by the sudden hesitation flickering across her face, for the first time since this ridiculous situation began, I had finally asked something she did not know how to answer. For nearly 5 full seconds Veronica Hayes did not answer me, and that alone was more revealing than anything she had said all afternoon, because up until that exact moment every sentence leaving her mouth had carried the absolute certainty of somebody who believed rules existed specifically to reinforce her authority. But now something had shifted. It was subtle, almost invisible to anyone not paying attention, just the slightest tightening near the corner of her mouth and the way her fingers instinctively gripped the edge of that oversized blue folder pressed against her waist. The warm August air felt heavier suddenly, thick with the scent of freshwater drifting off Blackwater Lake mixed with sun-baked pine needles scattered along the gravel path behind the cabin. Deputy Reynolds looked from me to Veronica, and for the first time since this conversation started I noticed uncertainty beginning to replace the quiet confidence he had been carrying since stepping out of that patrol vehicle. Veronica recovered quickly, faster than most people probably expected, and let out a short controlled laugh that sounded rehearsed enough to immediately tell me she was buying time. I am not sure why that matters, she said while lifting her sunglasses slightly higher against the bridge of her nose. Our development team handled all legal filings years ago before Blackwater Shores even completed construction. Ownership records were already established when the subdivision was approved. I nodded slowly, studying her face carefully. Interesting answer. But not the one I asked. She visibly disliked that. The deputy shifted his stance beside her while I glanced once more toward the eastern shoreline where dozens of expensive waterfront homes sat quietly in the distance, every single one of them built around one central promise I was suddenly becoming very curious about. Guaranteed lake access. Premium waterfront living. Exclusive private community boating privileges. I had seen their marketing brochures before. One of the contractors who repaired my dock pylons last spring left a copy accidentally in the maintenance shed after lunch. I remember flipping through it while drinking coffee that afternoon and noticing something amusing. Nearly every page focused more on Blackwater Lake than the homes themselves. Sunset kayaking. Private fishing access. Community marina privileges. Waterfront lifestyle ownership packages. Back then I barely thought about it because the entire development sat far enough away that I never expected interaction with the people living there. Standing here now, I realized I should have paid far more attention. Veronica crossed her arms tightly again, clearly irritated that this conversation had moved away from the script she expected. Deputy Reynolds looked toward me. Mr. Cole, if you are disputing the authority of the Homeowners Association over this property, then I will need to understand exactly what your legal objection is here. His tone had changed. Less authoritative now. More investigative. Good. I stared quietly across the dock for several seconds, letting the silence stretch just long enough that both of them became uncomfortable. Somewhere overhead a gust of wind moved through the upper pine branches with a dry rustling sound while small waves slapped rhythmically against the dock pilings beneath our feet. Then I turned and looked directly at the front door of my cabin sitting about 30 yards uphill against the ridge. Inside, locked behind the office wall safe I rarely opened, sat something I had not needed in nearly 4 years. A weathered brown leather document case my father handed me the day Blackwater Lake officially transferred into my holding company portfolio. Original county deeds. Parcel surveys. Environmental trust agreements. Corporate ownership filings bearing the exact information neither Veronica nor anyone inside Blackwater Shores apparently understood existed. I looked back toward Deputy Reynolds first, then slowly toward Veronica whose expression had hardened again, though I could see something else beneath it now. Hesitation. Very small. But finally there. I gave them both a calm smile and stepped backward toward the cabin stairs. You know what, officer? I think this conversation is about to become a lot more interesting. Because I have something inside I think both of you need to see. Neither of them said a word as I turned and started walking up the short cedar staircase leading toward the front porch. But I could feel the shift behind me immediately because confidence has a very specific rhythm when people think they control a situation and the second uncertainty enters the room, even the air itself seems to move differently. The gravel beneath my boots gave off that dry crunching sound I had heard thousands of times over the years while late afternoon sunlight stretched longer shadows across the cabin deck, painting narrow golden lines across the weathered pine siding my father and I installed ourselves nearly 6 years earlier during the final phase of construction. I pushed open the front door and stepped inside, instantly leaving behind the heat outside for the cool quiet interior where everything sat exactly as I left it that morning. The smell of cedarwood flooring mixed faintly with fresh coffee still lingering near the kitchen island and somewhere deeper inside the utility room I could hear the soft hum of the backup battery system cycling automatically. I moved past the living room windows overlooking Blackwater Lake and walked directly toward the office built into the rear corner of the cabin. It was not a large room. Just a solid oak desk, 2 leather chairs, 3 walls lined with bookshelves filled mostly with environmental law texts, land acquisition records, and corporate property filings accumulated over the better part of 15 years. Mounted behind the desk sat a black steel wall safe hidden partially behind a framed photograph of my father standing waist-deep in this same lake holding the first striped bass he ever taught me to catch when I was 12. I punched in the code without thinking because muscle memory takes over after enough repetition. The lock clicked softly and inside sat exactly what I expected. A weathered brown leather case worn smooth along the edges after years of storage and travel between law offices, county hearings, acquisition meetings, and environmental trust negotiations that eventually led me here. I lifted it carefully and for a brief second found myself smiling because I honestly could not remember the last time anyone forced me to open this thing. Outside through the office window I could still see Deputy Reynolds standing beside the cruiser near the dock, but what caught my attention immediately was Veronica. She was pacing now. Small movements. Sharp turns. Arms folded tighter than before. From this distance I could not hear what she was saying, but I did not need to. People only pace like that when the future they expected suddenly begins slipping sideways. I walked back through the living room and stepped onto the porch carrying the leather case loosely in one hand. The wind coming off the lake had cooled slightly now, carrying that clean freshwater scent I always noticed most strongly right before sunset. Deputy Reynolds straightened immediately the second he saw the documents. Veronica stopped pacing altogether. I walked slowly down toward them and placed the leather case flat against the hood of the sheriff cruiser between all three of us. The metal felt warm beneath my fingertips from sitting in direct sunlight all afternoon. Without saying anything, I opened the brass latch and folded the case open. Inside sat 6 original county-certified documents sealed inside protective sleeves, every one stamped with Travis County Registry authentication marks in raised blue ink. Deputy Reynolds leaned forward first. Veronica stayed frozen exactly where she stood. I carefully slid the top document from its sleeve and placed it directly in front of the deputy. The bold print stretched clearly across the upper third of the page. Blackwater Lake Preservation Holdings Limited Liability Company. Registered sole ownership parcel Group A through Group F. I looked directly at Deputy Reynolds as his eyes moved slowly down the first page. Then I watched something even more satisfying happen beside him. Veronica Hayes stopped smiling entirely. For several long seconds nobody moved and the only sound anywhere around us came from small waves tapping rhythmically against the lower dock supports as evening wind rolled steadily across Blackwater Lake, carrying cool air up from the deeper center basin where the water darkened almost navy blue whenever the sun started dropping behind the western ridge. Deputy Reynolds leaned farther over the hood of the cruiser, his eyes moving line by line across the county certification marks printed on the ownership document I had placed in front of him. I could practically see the exact second his brain started recalculating everything Veronica had spent the last hour telling him because his posture changed immediately. His shoulders straightened. His expression tightened. And most importantly, he stopped looking at me like somebody responding to a neighborhood compliance complaint and started looking at the paperwork like an officer realizing he may have stepped into something far more complicated than he expected. Veronica remained frozen beside him, but I noticed the change in her breathing first. Shorter now. Faster. The expensive confidence she had been wearing all afternoon was beginning to crack in small invisible places. That was the interesting thing about entitlement. It survives comfortably right up until objective reality enters the room. Deputy Reynolds slowly lifted the document closer to eye level and cleared his throat. Mr. Cole, I need to clarify something here. I folded my arms calmly against my chest and leaned lightly against the cruiser beside him. Of course. He looked back down at the page. According to this filing, Blackwater Lake Preservation Holdings Limited Liability Company possesses registered ownership over all 6 parcel groups connected to the entire lake basin including surrounding environmental shoreline protections and water access rights extending 412 acres total. Correct. Veronica immediately stepped closer. That cannot be right. Her voice came out sharper than she intended, the first genuine panic beginning to surface underneath the polished suburban authority she had been projecting all week. Deputy Reynolds did not even look at her. Instead he turned to the second document resting inside the leather case and carefully removed it from its sleeve. This one carried the full county survey overlay map printed nearly edge to edge in bright technical detail. Every property boundary surrounding Blackwater Lake appeared clearly marked in black parcel lines, including Blackwater Shores subdivision sitting neatly against the southeastern ridge. But unlike the colorful laminated map Veronica had brought earlier, this one showed something far more important. Every inch of open water, every boat access lane, every dock extension easement, every shoreline preservation zone all sat inside one single ownership boundary highlighted boldly across the center. My boundary. Deputy Reynolds stared silently for another 10 seconds before reaching for the radio clipped against his shoulder. Veronica stepped even closer now, visibly losing composure. Officer, there has to be some mistake. Our attorneys reviewed all development access agreements before the subdivision was ever approved. Deputy Reynolds finally looked directly at her for the first time in nearly 15 minutes, and I noticed his entire tone had changed completely. Professional now. Controlled. Careful. Ma'am, I am going to need dispatch verification through county parcel registry immediately. Veronica opened her mouth again but stopped herself halfway through whatever explanation she had been preparing. Somewhere further down the gravel road I noticed both luxury vehicles belonging to her board members slowly pulling forward now, their windows lowering slightly as curiosity began overtaking caution. Everyone wanted to hear what happened next. I stood quietly beside the cruiser watching evening sunlight reflect across hundreds of acres of water stretching peacefully behind us while Deputy Reynolds spoke into his radio requesting full parcel confirmation. Then I turned slightly toward Veronica and saw something I had been waiting for all afternoon. For the very first time since she knocked on my door 6 days earlier, Veronica Hayes looked exactly like someone beginning to understand that the world she thought she controlled had just stopped obeying her. The next 30 seconds unfolded with the kind of silence that only happens when reality begins dismantling a lie piece by piece and everyone standing nearby instinctively understands something important is happening even before they fully understand what it is. Deputy Reynolds kept one hand pressed lightly against the radio clipped to his shoulder while listening carefully to dispatch verifying county registry records somewhere miles away inside an office neither Veronica nor her precious homeowners association had apparently ever bothered consulting themselves. The evening air had cooled noticeably now and shadows stretched longer across the gravel road leading down toward my dock while the surface of Blackwater Lake shimmered softly behind us under fading amber sunlight. Veronica stood perfectly still beside the cruiser but I noticed her right hand trembling slightly where it rested against the edge of that blue folder. Small details reveal everything when confidence begins collapsing. Behind her, both luxury sport utility vehicles carrying Blackwater Shores board members had now rolled completely forward and parked only 15 feet away. Doors opened slowly. 3 people stepped out. The same silver-haired man holding a clipboard from yesterday afternoon. The woman with oversized sunglasses who kept typing on her phone. And another man I recognized vaguely from seeing him drive a pontoon boat near the southern marina earlier that summer. None of them spoke. They simply stood there watching Deputy Reynolds. Waiting. The radio crackled sharply and the deputy immediately straightened. Copy that, dispatch. Repeat parcel verification. There was a short burst of static followed by another voice too faint for anyone except him to hear clearly. Then everything changed. Deputy Reynolds lowered his hand slowly from the radio and looked directly at the ownership document still spread open across the hood of the cruiser. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost every trace of uncertainty. County Registry confirms active ownership exactly as filed here. Blackwater Lake Preservation Holdings Limited Liability Company currently maintains sole registered ownership rights over the entire Blackwater Lake Basin including all environmental shorelines, navigational access corridors, recreational permits, and waterfront easement controls totaling 412.7 acres. Nobody moved. Veronica stared at him blankly like her brain had simply refused to process the sentence she had just heard. One of the board members behind her took 2 slow steps forward. Wait a second, he said sharply, looking directly at Veronica now instead of me. That is impossible. Our purchase agreement specifically included guaranteed private lake access privileges attached to every waterfront property inside Blackwater Shores. The woman beside him lowered her sunglasses completely for the first time. Veronica, what exactly is he talking about? I remained silent because moments like this should never be interrupted. Veronica opened her mouth once, stopped, then tried again. There has to be some mistake with the county records. Deputy Reynolds immediately shook his head. Ma'am, county parcel ownership verification is not mistaken. I watched the silver-haired board member slowly pull folded documents from inside his clipboard while visibly scanning through pages faster with every second. Then his face changed. I recognized that expression immediately. It was the exact look investors make when they discover a contract nobody bothered reading closely enough. He lifted one paper and stared directly at Veronica. These development disclosures only mention access agreements contingent on legal water rights authorization. He paused and read another line silently. There is no ownership transfer listed anywhere. The woman standing beside him took a sharp breath and stepped backward. Veronica turned slowly toward them, but no words came out this time. Across the lake, the last sunlight finally disappeared behind the ridge, leaving only long dark reflections stretching over water she had spent days claiming her community controlled. I looked at her standing there surrounded by the very people who trusted her authority and understood the real collapse had only just begun. Because Veronica Hayes had not simply embarrassed herself today. She had accidentally exposed an entire community built on promises nobody legally had the right to sell. What happened next was somehow even more satisfying than watching Veronica lose control in front of Deputy Reynolds, because the moment people discover their own money may be connected to deception, loyalty disappears faster than pride ever can. The evening had settled fully now, and the last traces of sunlight hanging over Blackwater Lake had faded into deep violet reflections stretching across perfectly still water, while warm lights inside the distant Blackwater Shores subdivision began flickering on one by one along the eastern ridge. The lake looked peaceful again, completely indifferent to the chaos unfolding beside my dock. Veronica stood near the front of the sheriff cruiser, clutching that oversized blue folder so tightly the laminated map inside had begun bending near the corners. She had not spoken in nearly 20 seconds, and I could practically see her mind scrambling desperately for some version of reality that still left her in control. But she had run out of room. The silver-haired board member stepped directly in front of her now, no longer pretending to stand beside her as an ally. His voice carried sharp disbelief that cut through the quiet shoreline harder than anything spoken so far. "Veronica, did you know about this?" She immediately shook her head, too quickly. "Of course not. Our legal review team handled all subdivision compliance documents before development was finalized." The woman standing beside him folded her arms tightly and stared at Veronica with open anger now. "Then why exactly have you spent the last 6 months increasing community fees under the justification of expanded lake management operations?" That one landed hard. I remembered hearing from a contractor months earlier that Blackwater Shores recently raised annual association dues almost 40%. At the time I assumed typical suburban politics. Apparently there was more to that story. Veronica took a step backward, visibly cornered now. Those fee increases were approved through projected waterfront maintenance planning. The man holding the clipboard interrupted immediately. "Waterfront maintenance planning for property we apparently do not even legally control." Deputy Reynolds stood silently listening, but I noticed him reaching for his tablet again, likely documenting everything unfolding in real time. "Good." Veronica looked toward him instinctively, like someone hoping borrowed authority might somehow save her one last time. "Officer, this is clearly some misunderstanding connected to outdated development records." Reynolds did not even entertain the attempt. "Ma'am, at this point I strongly recommend you stop making legal assertions regarding property ownership until your association verifies its original development filings independently." The woman beside the silver-haired board member exhaled sharply and reached into her purse, pulling out folded purchase disclosures while scanning page after page with increasing frustration. "I paid almost $2 million for waterfront property specifically marketed under exclusive private lake privileges." She looked directly at Veronica now, her voice lower but somehow far more dangerous. "Are you telling me none of us ever had actual rights to this lake?" Veronica said nothing. That silence answered everything better than words ever could. Across the gravel shoulder, the third board member slowly removed his phone and began stepping away from the group, already dialing someone. Probably an attorney. Smart move. I stood quietly beside the cruiser with one hand resting on the open leather document case, breathing in the cool freshwater air drifting steadily across the shoreline while listening to the exact sound entitlement makes when it finally collapses. It does not sound dramatic. It sounds expensive. Deputy Reynolds finally turned toward Veronica one last time, his expression now entirely procedural. Miss Hayes, based on what has been presented here today, I will be documenting this incident as a potentially false complaint involving disputed property authority claims. And standing there watching every person who once supported her slowly begin turning away one by one, Veronica Hayes finally understood the one truth she should have learned before ever stepping foot on my property. The problem with pretending to control something you do not own is eventually the real owner shows up. 3 weeks later the silence had returned exactly the way I always intended it to exist here, and standing alone on the western dock just after sunrise with a ceramic mug of black coffee warming my hands, I found myself appreciating something simple most people spend their entire lives misunderstanding. Peace is never truly valuable until somebody tries taking it from you. The morning air rolling across Blackwater Lake felt cooler now than it had that afternoon when Veronica Hayes arrived so certain she controlled a world she never bothered understanding. Thin layers of fog drifted low across the far eastern waterline where the first orange streaks of sunrise were beginning to break slowly over the ridge, casting soft reflections across 400 acres of perfectly still freshwater stretching farther than the eye could comfortably follow. Somewhere behind the cabin I could hear wind chimes moving gently near the porch, and farther up the pine slope a pair of mockingbirds traded lazy morning calls through branches still wet with early condensation. Everything felt right again. Quiet. Predictable. Mine. The fallout moved faster than I expected after that afternoon. Within 48 hours several Blackwater Shores homeowners hired independent attorneys after reviewing original purchase disclosures connected to their property contracts. Turns out the entire subdivision had been aggressively marketed for years around exclusive waterfront privilege packages built almost entirely on carefully worded language implying private lake rights that legally never existed. Community marina access, protected recreational boating zones, exclusive resident shoreline privileges. None of it held actual ownership authority. Technically clever enough to avoid obvious fraud on paper, but dangerously misleading once buyers started asking expensive questions. Veronica disappeared from public view almost immediately after the board called an emergency meeting 2 nights later. I heard through one of the contractors who regularly serviced the southern marina that she had been formally removed from all association leadership roles pending legal review over unauthorized fee increases tied to fabricated waterfront management programs she spent nearly 6 months expanding. Apparently homeowners became deeply interested in discovering where all those additional lake maintenance fees had actually been going. Funny how curiosity grows the second people realize money may have changed hands under false assumptions. Deputy Reynolds stopped by briefly 2 days after the incident to return copies of the documentation I provided and quietly informed me county investigators had begun reviewing subdivision development records connected to original shoreline easement filings submitted years earlier during Blackwater Shores construction approval. I thanked him and left it there. I never cared much about what happened next because by then the only thing that mattered had already happened. My peace had been restored. I took another sip of coffee and looked out across the endless open water shimmering softly under growing morning light while the old aluminum fishing boat drifted gently beside the dock exactly where I left it the night before. The same dock where 6 days earlier Veronica Hayes stood convinced she had enough authority to force obedience simply because she had spent too long confusing power with control. That was always the mistake people like her make. They think rules belong to the loudest voice in the room. They think confidence can replace truth. They think status gives them ownership over spaces they never earned. I smiled quietly and set the coffee mug beside the tackle box resting near my boots before picking up the same graphite fishing rod I had been carrying the afternoon everything changed. My father taught me something years ago standing on this exact shoreline when I was barely old enough to understand business. Real ownership is not about telling people what to do. It is about protecting what belongs to you when somebody arrogant enough believes they can take it. Veronica Hayes thought she was forcing me into her community. She never realized she was standing beside a lake I had owned long before she ever learned my name.